Copenhagen Ocean Hub, and is also an honorary professor of the University of Seychelles, one of the directors of the Safe Seas Network on Maritime Security, and of course, more recently, a research fellow at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. And as it just so happens, Professor Christian Bueger has been on an actual spree of publications in recent years, including the very latest one, which has just been published together and co-authored with Professor Tim Edmonds from the University of Bristol, and which is basically, or essentially, an attempt to provide a manual for us to understand the current dynamics and the current problematics associated with the topic of maritime security. And therefore, our invitation to Professor Christian Bueger was to come and present us this new book just published with the Oxford University Press, and to give us an overall tour de force, I would say, on maritime security. Christian, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It's a privilege for us. This entire talk is structured around a couple of programs from CEI-Iscte, including first and foremost the PhD International Studies, the Master's International Studies, the Master's in Oceans Governance and Sustainability, and of course it is a part of the largest cycle of PhD conferences for the School of Public Policies and Sociology of CEI-Iscte. So quite a lot of different elements came together just to give coverage to your talk today. But again, thank you so much. And of course, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for the kind invitation, for the kind words. It's wonderful to see you all here. First of all, a number of thanks. First of all, to the Atlantic Center. We had a wonderful seminar in the morning, and this is actually what originally brought me here. And we were talking about illegal fishing in the morning, which is quite obviously one of the big issues on the maritime security agenda. It's wonderful to be at CEI-Iscte. It's my first time, and big thank you for Pedro for inviting me here and spending the evening together with you, the early evening. And it's also Halloween, so hopefully none of this is too scary. Pedro told me that this is going to be, or supposed to be, a maritime security feast. And as in any good feast, there are several courses. And please do recognize that my brief talk, my introduction to the book, that is only the starters, while the main course is actually our discussion afterwards. So I very much look forward to all of your questions and comments. And literally, there are no stupid questions. There are only stupid answers. So it's going to be on me in any case. So very much looking forward to engage with you on the book. As Pedro was just mentioning, the idea of the book is literally to develop a sort of go-to source where beginners, but also professionals, would find some answers of what maritime security is about, why it is difficult, and what to do about it. And it's literally a project that almost took 10 years to complete. And so much of knowledge and experience and running around at different places, giving talks, teaching maritime security, all of this went into this book. So it is a particular special piece also for myself. What is the key argument of the book? The key argument is that maritime security is an example of a complex security field. It is complex, and I will talk you through that a little bit, both in terms of the history, the issues involved, the legal context, the space in which it takes place, that is fluid, but also in terms of the actors that actually deal with maritime security. A lot of people will instantly think, it's navies. But actually, the more you dive into it, the more complex it gets in terms of who is actually responsible for maritime security. So that's then the core point about the book, is to show the complexity and then also argue, well, complexity is not something we should be afraid of or scared of. There are actually strategies of how we can deal with this. And this is then what we try to offer in the book, basically an attempt to connect the dots and go beyond what is usually the case, that lawyers discuss the law, naval strategists discuss naval strategy, and so on, and bring it basically together. One of the key arguments is also that a book like this prepares us for the future of maritime security. And I like to come back to this question towards the end. What are actually the current trends that will drive our engagement with the sea, that will define maritime security 10, 20 years from onwards? And since I've learned today, we are actually hosted by the Department of History. That's correct. It is, every historian knows that in order to understand the future, you need to have a good grasp of history. And you'll find some of this history in the book, and let me then also start with this. Now, what is important for me about maritime security is, first of all, that it is only one way of how we can look at the oceans. There are 4 other ways of looking at the oceans, and the other way is the discussion around blue economy, sustainably exploiting the sea, is the discussion around ocean health, protecting the marine environment, and also looking into questions of blue justice, the question of how ocean resources are actually being distributed, as well as the risks around ocean economies. So that's actually quite important in terms of when we are talking about maritime security, we're talking about the oceans and how they're supposed to be governed. Now, maritime security is fascinating exactly because it connects different discussions on the oceans. And this is basically a matrix I actually developed almost 10 years ago. And it is in many ways still not outdated, and I find this fascinating. And the core argument here is that if we want to understand what maritime security is, we should not try to define it, but instead look at how it relates to other concepts. And these concepts are then exactly the blue economy, marine safety, human security, as well as the more traditional sea power and national security concerns. So in many ways, these are discussions that precede maritime security, because as we argue in the book, maritime security as an idea and as an agenda actually only kicks off in the 1990s. But obviously, sea power discourses go back to the Roman age, and the marine safety discussions go back at least to the debate on the Titanic. I assume people will have seen the movie, so they know maritime safety started out with the idea that it would be smart to put some rescue boats on large passenger ships. Now, saying that maritime security is sort of diverse, quite obviously doesn't do the trick in its own right. So what we do in the book is we propose this triangle as our core understanding of maritime security, in the sense that we argue there are 3 big issues that we need to look at. And then guess what? Each of these issues also gets a chapter in the book. And let me talk you very quickly through it. First of all, maritime security often is about interstate disputes, border disputes, but also can have a geopolitical dimension. And here, for instance, the fish wars are quite a prominent example. Situation in the South China Sea, and so on. The second type of issue is extremist violence or terrorism at sea. And that is different from interstate disputes because it is done by by non-state actors rather than by states. However, both interstate disputes as well as extremist violence are conducted for political ends. And that is then the main difference to blue crime. When we're talking about terrorism at sea, there actually have not been that many incidents. But it's something that we should keep on the agenda, and it was quite important actually in driving the maritime security debates in the early 2000s. I will come to that in a second. Now, our third category is what we call blue crimes. That is different forms of transnational organized crime at sea. And we rely actually here not on a legal definition, but on a criminological understanding of it. And part of the beauty of a criminology is not to start out from the idea, what is a crime in law, but what is actually an activity that causes harm, right? Which causes damage and perhaps should be criminalized in the law, but not always necessarily is so. And that leads us to three different kinds of maritime crime. The first one is the crime where the harm is actually caused on the ship, right? Think about piracy in the Gulf of Guinea or piracy in Somalia. Here you have criminals who are attacking a ship and trying to hold it hostage. The second one is different types of smuggling, right? And all sorts of things get smuggled at sea, whether that is narcotics, whether that is people, whether that is weapons, cigarettes, all sorts of counterfeits, wildlife, and so on. If you ask the question, where is the harm being caused? It is not at sea. It is actually on land. Right? So here the sea is just a conduit for causing harm. And last but not least is the big issue that we discussed in the morning, the dimension of environmental crime. And here the victim of the crimes is actually the ocean itself. It is the fish, it is the marine biodiversity that is being harmed, and illegal fishing is one example. Pollution is another one. Everything that damages the marine environment. So this is basically then the issues that we're looking at in the book, and I'm really happy about any questions on these issues, crimes across regions, and so on. The book tries to be very comprehensive. Many of our examples are actually from the Western Indian Ocean region, because that's what I know the best, but also from Asia and the Atlantic, and partially from Europe too. Now, I promised to provide a short history of maritime security. And in the book, we actually tell this history in that we argue there have been different waves of maritime security. Wave, maritime metaphor, kind of makes sense, but it is a little bit more than a metaphor in the sense that we argue that there have been certain topics and they got relatively big. They left a sort of sediment, and then came the next wave, and they are partially overlapping. And if you're running through that, the birthplace of maritime security is in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and the core issue was terrorism. It was the fear over a large-scale terrorist attack on a port using a ship, and that basically drove very much the early agenda of maritime security, led to a lot of activities in the International Maritime Organization that regulates shipping and ports, and brought basically a large-scale response by the United States. Wave 2 then is closely linked with Somali piracy, and that kicks off in 2008. And it ends roughly in 2012. And what was spectacular about Somali piracy was how quickly the international community actually managed to put multinational forces together and ended the problem in a relatively short time. You might have seen in the news, however, that the Somali pirates are back now, which is slightly worrying. Anyhow, wave 2, piracy. And if you have wondered where Christian, one of the authors, enters the picture, that is in wave 2. That is when basically also I started to look into maritime security. Wave 3 is then about the consolidation of the agenda. Actors start recognizing that there are more issues than terrorism and piracy. A lot of attention to smuggling, illegal fishing. And the first country starts spelling out comprehensive maritime security strategies. You get the first maritime security strategy by the European Union, but also the UK, France, Spain issue comprehensive strategies to deal with it. You get more and more attention to environmental crimes, but also an expansion of support programs around the world. Right? A lot of capacity building program, and that is then the fourth wave, the expansion of maritime security worldwide. Now, as I said, this is the history of maritime security, and looking at this, one of the big questions that we ask in the book is, what about the future? Are we still in this wave 4, or are we actually in a wave 5? And as good academics, we discussed that in the last chapter, but don't have an answer to it. But I very much look forward to discuss that later on with you, and perhaps you have an answer to that question. Before we move to the future, let's dive a little bit into 2 of the chapters that I'm quite passionate about in the book. One is a chapter that was really difficult and painful to write almost. And that was the ludicrous idea to write something like the who is who of maritime security. The idea to try to map out and capture what kind of actors are actually involved. And this is in many ways really messy, even if you only look at the governmental level. Countries such as the UK have more than 30 agencies that deal with maritime security in one way than the other. Indonesia, for instance, has more than 20 agencies that do maritime security. And there's now a mapping by the European Commission, and they came up with more than 300 maritime security agencies in all of Europe. So that just kind of like tells us about the complexity involved if we're only looking at the governmental side of things. The debate is often structured around the question of navies versus coast guards. And yes, navies and coast guards are among the most important agencies in maritime security. But in almost all countries, there are more agencies than that. It is fishery regulators, it is energy agencies, it is environmental protection agencies, border management, and so on, customs. So the picture usually is very messy and complex. However, we should not reduce maritime security to these national actors. Indeed, there's quite a large variety of international organizations that has a role in one way or the other. I was mentioning already the International Maritime Organization, but there's also the Food and Agriculture Organization that does illegal fishery, for instance, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the International Organization for Migration. It is quite a high number of actors. And in the follow-up report that will come out next week, that continues some of the work in the book, we actually do a more detailed mapping of the United Nations system. And it is quite messy. There are so many actors involved. There's one agency that does maps and so on. Then quite obviously, you also have informal international organizations, right? the G7, BRICS, the Quad. You have organizations like the Yaoundé Code of Conduct, the Djibouti Code of Conduct, different kinds of contact groups. And indeed, much of the response to maritime security, in particular during wave 2 and 3, was handled by informal governance mechanisms. Whether that is good or bad, we can discuss. There's also more and more non-governmental organizations. Initially, it was only environmental organizations that looked into illegal fishing. Quite obviously, the migration wave in the Mediterranean brought a lot of search and rescue NGOs into the picture. There's a growing number of NGOs that look at human rights violations at sea. Very, very important work. However, there's not necessarily any NGO that would look at maritime security per se. There are some think tanks, including the Atlantic Center, that do a lot of maritime security work, but there's actually less institutions than you think there would be. Finally, industries. And here's the link to the blue economy that I was talking about earlier. Often maritime security discussions are only about the shipping industry. Shipping industry, yes, very important, but there are other industries. There's the offshore oil and gas industry. There's the offshore green energy industry, but then quite obviously there's also fishery. There is different forms of transportation, passengers, and last but not least also the cruise line industry. Let's not forget 7 million people every year take a cruise line. At no single point in time in history, more people have been out at sea exactly because of that. Then you also have private security companies, quite obviously, that are working with the industries. So this gives us basically an idea of what the range of actors are and why it is so complex. And if you read that chapter in the book, it's messy, but hopefully still fun reading. So one of the other chapters is called the toolbox of maritime security. And here we are literally running through the different responses to the maritime security challenges and look at what kind of advantages and disadvantages they have. I can discuss not all of this in detail here, quite obviously. If you're interested in one of these responses, please, let's discuss that later on. Just to run very quickly through it, I was mentioning already informal governance institutions. These can be absolutely fantastic if you need a fast and rapid pragmatic response to an issue, such as piracy. However, they also come with a price. And the price is you can hold no one accountable for what they've done and what they haven't done. And you also have a justice problem because you cannot sue, for instance, or claim access to an informal governance institution, which you can with a formal institution. But if you're a coastal community organization and you want to participate, there's no way you can do so in an informal mechanism. Maritime domain awareness refers to the initiatives of conducting surveillance out at sea, knowing what is actually happening. And this is also a fascinating story in its own right, because there's literally now a global network of centers that tries to develop a situational picture for different regional seas and connect the different national attempts. Many countries have dedicated maritime security strategies. I was talking about it. It can be a super important tool to organize the mess I was talking about, either on national level or on regional level. Last thing I like to flag is the importance of capacity building. And I remember that Pedro actually, a number of years ago, before he moved into government, he tried to map all the capacity building activities in the Gulf of Guinea. And I think he had a couple of sleepless nights. And he also recognized afterwards that the map was never complete, because the moment when he thought he's done, a new initiative popped up. Exactly. So there's a massive amount of assistance being done. This is not always money well spent for various reasons. it is often more about diplomatic relations and geopolitics, trying to assist a country, than it is actually about scaling up the game. So, a very complicated universe in its own right. So this is sort of the repertoire of maritime security solution. Let's talk about the future. If that was kind of like what we have, what is going to bother us in the future? What is it that we need to pay attention to? Talking about the future, quite obviously, is not an easy task. Here we are trying to address it by asking ourselves, what are the trends that are already here that will continue and will gain more force? The first one is the move towards digitalization and automation of maritime space. And that includes automated shipping, but it also includes the increasing use of uncrewed vessels by navies. But we see it, for instance, also being used by non-state actors such as the Houthis in the Red Sea. So this is basically a major shift in terms of what you can do at sea and how you can prosecute or conduct law enforcement at sea. The entire question, the entire legal complex around uncrewed vessels is pretty much undefined, right? So there's a substantial need actually for developing new norms, ideally at a United Nations level. And obviously it also brings us to the question of cybersecurity, because more automation and digitalization creates new vulnerabilities. And that can be anything from ransomware attacks that you see increasingly in the maritime industry to attempts to hack navigation system. And we see a lot of spoofing going on, for instance, now in the Black Sea, but also linked to what is called the shadow fleet, dark vessels, and so on. So this is all part of it. In an interesting way, it also means that satellites, what happens in outer space, is also becoming increasingly more important. In the future, you will be able to hack a ship by hacking a satellite first, right? So basically outer space and maritime space become more and more interwoven. And so we need to look up when we're talking about maritime security. The second mega trend is what we are currently studying in our ocean infrastructure research group. And that is the fact that many regional seas are becoming more and more industrialized. If you look at a space such as the Baltic Sea or the North Sea, this is hardly an open sea anymore. Wherever you look, there is a piece of infrastructure, either on the subsea or more visible as an energy platform, or even more invisible as a marine protected area or declared fishery zone, or as a navigational device. In the North Sea, we are literally running out of space. It becomes more and more difficult to build new infrastructures. And this is a trend that we're also going to see in other regional seas. The Mediterranean is next and is getting very close to that. And that means we have to adjust our thinking a little bit, because perhaps no longer is freedom of navigation the main problem, but how we actually protect and care for these infrastructures. And that requires a little bit of a strategic mind shift. So critical infrastructure protection becomes one of the core challenges. The third mega trend is, I assume, very obvious for everyone here in the room. You've seen the recent extreme weather events in Spain happening. We have seen extreme weather events, however, all over the world. And the climate crisis, quite obviously, has also a deep impact on ocean space. How will that matter for maritime security? It's not immediately obvious, but basically what we can see or what we can predict is new patterns of blue crime, first of all. Just think about, because of global warming, fish stocks move to other areas. And that quite obviously also will mean that illegal fishing will be in other areas. But this is just one example. Secondly, it also means that there will be higher demands for law enforcement. One of the ways of how to protect marine biodiversity is through stricter laws. And we have a new treaty for the high seas, the BBNJ treaty, that foresees marine protected areas on the high seas. Someone will have to enforce the rules now, and that will be, most of the times, it will be navies, which have the capacity to go out there. So there's a new spectrum of tasks coming ahead. Maritime security forces will also be increasingly needed for dealing with extreme weather events, whether that's storms or floods, tsunamis, and so on. And let's not forget that many navies in particular, they are perfectly equipped to provide very rapid disaster relief because they can operate from the sea. Lastly, I think it's also important to ask what kind of damage do actually maritime security forces do to the climate? Let's not forget navies are major climate CO2 emitters. Right? The US Navy is really dirty. Many navies are dirty. So there's also the question, what kind of contributions can military forces and other security forces actually make to reduce emissions, but also to support climate mitigation? So one example that we have in the book is the Pakistani Navy, for instance. They planted 1 million mangroves, right? And mangroves are really important to protect coastal areas against sea level rise, but also as a carbon sink. So ask yourself, what is the Portuguese Navy doing for climate change mitigation? What are any navies doing? And we need to start asking these questions, because no one stands outside the climate crisis, and that includes the military. The fourth trend that we're discussing in the book is a little bit puzzling, because when we are thinking about climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, then we clearly know we need to think about the planet. We are all in this together. It's a challenge of humanity, right? So all countries need to work together to address this. However, we are living at times where geopolitical tensions and geopolitical thinking is returning. Increasingly, high-level decision makers think about the world in different geostrategic blocks. They have started to think again in spheres of influence, whether that is presented as the US versus China or in other bipolar terms. And that quite obviously means that it will be increasingly more difficult to find the multilateral and planetary solutions that we actually need. And how we manage this tension between geopolitics and geopolitical rivalry on the one side and the need for planetary solutions, that is one of the core driving dilemmas for the future of maritime security. And this is also why it's important that we continuously need to remind ourselves, if we want to address problems such as not only climate change, but also problems such as piracy, transnational organized crime, illegal fishing, nations need to work together independently from geopolitical rivalry. That brings me to the last point before it's time for your questions and your comments. I know there's a lot on the menu, but choose and pick so we can enter the main course, the discussion. The last point is what keeps me busy at the moment, which is the question, what kind of international institutions does maritime security actually need? I was talking about the mess of maritime security-related international organization. The problem is that everyone does a little piece of it. UNODC does crime prevention, the International Organization for Migration does border management, the IMO regulates shipping and port. The UN Security Council, quite obviously, is the most important body, engages with emergencies. There's a piracy outbreak here, there's a piracy outbreak there. The General Assembly actually has an annual resolution, but who in this room has ever read this resolution? Who actually pays attention what goes into this resolution? Not many. So we need to start thinking about what can we do better and differently to address these challenges. And that does not necessarily all have to be on a global, on a United Nations level, but much of it can also be on a regional level. And I think there were big opportunities missed in the 1990s and the early 2000s when the maritime security agenda started to build maritime security into regional regimes, in particular the regional seas conventions for the Mediterranean, or the Nairobi Convention in the Western Indian Ocean, for instance, and also start linking the regional fishery organizations to security concerns. So this is the kind of stuff that we need to really pay attention to. And for whoever is in the room and is looking for an exciting new research project, that will require a lot of manpower to look into those solutions. So fantastic, whether you're a master student, a PhD student, or a senior researcher, we need all of you to address this. Let me wrap this up. The core argument of the book is that maritime security is about mastering complexity. You've seen this was quite a long ride across different issues and problems. And part of the beauty, the fascination in maritime security is how it allows us to connect these different challenges, also allows us to connect different theories. I haven't addressed that, but we'll hopefully talk about that. There's also an analytical or framework chapter in this. But obviously, there is something like an established toolbox of maritime security solutions, but it needs ongoing refinement and so on, more people trying to map out all capacity building initiatives and so on. The big question that I see at the moment is how we can design international institutions to handle these big trends that I was talking about. And we really need to work on this to find better solutions for the global trends. I leave it here, and now let's move to the main course. But thank you so much for your attention.